Catholic Education Sandhurst acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Teaching should not be as hard as it sometimes feels for teachers or for students. In this episode of Magnify Matters, Tim Edwards is joined by Katie Webster and Katie Roberts-Hull from Teachwell for a conversation about what it takes to translate evidence into everyday classroom practice. Drawing on their work across more than 900 schools, Katie Webster and Katie Roberts-Hull reflect on the realities of school improvement, from early career teaching experiences to system-wide professional learning, and what it takes to move beyond one-off professional development to something that genuinely shifts teaching. As partners in the Magnify Sandhurst journey, they connect research to practice, exploring how modelling, feedback and sustained support build teacher confidence and create the conditions for every student to learn. Whether you're in a classroom, leading a school, or working across a system, this episode offers practical insight and a clear reminder that improving teaching is not about doing more, but about doing what works consistently and well. Now stay with us as we magnify what truly matters in education.
Katie Roberts-Hull and Katie Webster join us today from Teachwell. Welcome, Katie and Katie.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
We are privileged to have you, and we've been working more closely with the team at Teachwell over the last 8 months or so. We might start with you, Katie Webster. Could you give us a bit of a rundown as to who you are, where you're from, and the work that you're doing with Teachwell?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Katie Webster and I'm based in Perth, Western Australia. So pretty far away from your location, but spend a lot of time now on the East Coast as part of my work at Teachwell. And I am the director of Teachwell, and I've been here as part of the team for almost 6 years, so coming up to 6 years. And prior to my time at Teachwell, I spent many years in school improvement, so looking after schools and school leadership teams and basically identifying what are the levers that school leaders have to improve student outcomes. And as you'll probably guess, one of those big levers is what happens in the classroom every day with students. And from that work, became really interested in teaching and learning specifically and looking at the evidence base around high impact instruction. And through my work in that space, my boss at the time, Ingrid Seeley, actually then went off and established Teachwell in 2019. And I joined her towards the end of 2020. So that's sort of my experience and part of the background of Teachwell.
Thanks, Katie. A great intro, and we'll delve into all aspects that you just covered. And Katie Roberts-Hull in Melbourne today. Katie, a bit of an intro.
I am based in Melbourne, but I'm originally from the US. I've lived in Australia for the last 11 years, and I started my career as a teacher in Texas on the border of Mexico, working in a disadvantaged school. And when I started teaching, I just felt like it shouldn't be as hard as it was when I was originally teaching for the first time. Not getting that much support, not getting that much in terms of quality curriculum materials. And so really since then, since that experience, I've just been interested in this question of how can we make teaching easier for teachers and also make teaching better for students. And so I've really, for the last 10 years, been working on that question, especially around teacher professional learning, looking at sort of what works best for supporting teachers and supporting schools to support teachers. And I'm one of the newer members of the Teachwell team. I just joined last year when Teachwell was joining forces with Ochre Education. And I've just been, I guess, really privileged to work with Katie and the rest of the team. They're all exceptional educators that have been working with teachers in terms of their professional development over the last few years as well, and have accomplished a great deal, much without me. I'm just lucky to be on board now and to be kind of the first member on the East Coast of Australia as part of the team.
Let's just start on school improvement, because both of you have been in that space. Katie Roberts-Hull, you just mentioned about professional learning, what works best, and some research in that space. And Katie, before you joined Teachwell as 6 years ago, I think you mentioned, you were doing some work in school improvement. So what have you got to share in terms of things that you've found, research perhaps, that identifies how schools might improve their performance for outcomes for kids and satisfaction for staff and all that goes in all areas of school improvement?
I think I was working as part of the school improvement program with the Fogarty Foundation. They are actually now part of the Knowledge Society, which I know you know well, Tim, as one of your partners at Sandhurst with Classroom Mastery. And I think one of the key learnings that we had early on in the school improvement program was a system of support and accountability for school leaders to come out of school and have some targeted professional learning days and lots of opportunities to actually discuss as a school leadership team where they wanted to put their energies and their priorities. And it actually became really evident to me quite early on that it is all about distilling those priorities down to maybe 3 at most and having really focused then conversations about how to improve some of those priorities in their schools. And so what we really did was to support them to identify from the research what truly makes a difference. And I can tell you that one of the main things that schools would work on as part of that school improvement program in year 1 was getting that orderly learning environment. So really focusing on the conditions which they could then leverage off into teaching and learning, or certainly looking at then attendance data, but having that orderly learning environment, that calm, those clear conditions for students, that was really pivotal. And that was one of the main things that also came out of the research. So when we looked at high performing schools across Australia and internationally, it was really clear that they did all have this orderly learning environment. These conditions were really well set in their schools for students to come in, know what was expected of them, and get into the teaching and learning.
Katie, thank you for that, and thanks for naming our partnership with the Knowledge Society and Classroom Mastery as something that's profoundly impacted our schools over the last 12 months or more now, regarding calm, predictable and safe learning environments. That needs to be in place before learning can take place. Katie Roberts-Hull, did that echo with any of your work on that border of New Mexico and Texas, or you as an early career teacher, or any of the research that you've looked at since?
I think what I experienced as a new teacher is what a lot of teachers, unfortunately, might still be experiencing in other systems today, which is that kind of experience of one-off professional learning, or like going to a workshop for a day or maybe a couple of days a year and wanting to bring that back. Sometimes the workshops were kind of theoretical or really high level. And so it was difficult to think about, well, what specifically could I do in my classroom tomorrow to improve student learning? And what Teachwell is doing, I think, is kind of flipping that. So what I found in my research just before I joined Teachwell, looking at, what do high-performing systems around the world do as part of my work when I was working for Learning First, or looking at kind of summaries of evidence of what works best in professional learning, a lot of it is about that continuous support for teachers in practice. So getting into things like the EEF report says about high quality professional learning, like things that are really important for students as well, like managing teachers' cognitive load, but also revisiting prior learning, not just having that one-off, and getting into specific teaching techniques where teachers can actually see those modeled, can sort of see examples of what that looks like in different contexts, do some rehearsal, and get feedback on their own practices. And that is basically the foundation of the programs that Teachwell has built over time, and getting to that granularity of like, what does this actually look like in practice? So we know, for example, that revisiting prior learning is good for students. But what does that look like? In terms of daily review, can we see some examples of teachers actually doing that in practice? And things like full participation, which link really well with that classroom management that you were just talking about, Tim, and making sure that there's kind of instructional routines so that students know what to expect and that there's more time on task and kind of more clarity around expectations for students. That all links to that full participation environment in schools as well, making sure that students can't opt out of the learning, even if they're, not misbehaving. There's a lot of students that just might not be cognitively engaging sort of while instruction is happening. So theory about, okay, we need this full participation environment for all students to learn is really good for teachers to know about, but they really want to know, well, specifically, what does that look like? What are some tactics that I can have in my toolkit as a teacher that I can sort of flexibly deploy for supporting my students every day in my classroom. And so that's what I've been really interested to see Teach Well working on since I've joined. And even the kind of extensive work that we've done across the country has been useful because we do take those videos of teacher practice to give teachers feedback. And so we're constantly seeing teachers, using practices and seeing kind of where their challenges are, and then being able to ask permission from teachers to show those videos to other teachers to get to that kind of granularity of like, what does this look like in practice? So that's definitely been something that's different than, I guess, what I originally experienced when I started teaching. Having those models, those really clear examples tied to research and being able to kind of do that in an ongoing way that isn't just a one-off professional learning experience.
Katie, you have touched on 1,000 different items then. Thank you for taking us on so many different paths. Just before we get to more detail about Teach Well, Katie, I'm just interested still in that school improvement space, and you might take us to perhaps a couple of the other things from when you were doing that work with Fogarty Foundation or others to talk about other particular areas. And again, Katie, if you don't mind sort of speaking a bit about what you learned at Learning First regarding what you mentioned at the start, system of support and accountability, and how that might work with regard to overall school improvement.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that system of support and accountability as part of that school improvement program, that looked like schools actually staying with us for 3 years. So it's quite a big, long commitment. But what they found was that by locking in essentially to 3 years of school improvement support and accountability, they got the work done that they wanted in their school. So they were able to align on those priorities and spend a lot of dedicated time away from the distractions that happen every day in school, working on these big priorities. So often schools starting with that orderly learning environment, but then very quickly working in their way into the teaching and learning space. And what that looked like was actually identifying from the evidence base, what are the high impact instructional strategies that allow every child to improve in their learning, regardless of their starting point. And this is something that Katie's touched on as well. But what we also discovered was that a lot of the schools did not have a lot of that knowledge base in which to then transfer that into classrooms. So what did it actually look like? They really wanted to see it being modelled by experts. They wanted to see it being rehearsed in classrooms with real students. And so we looked at providing a lot of those supports throughout the program so that it would build the capacity of these school leadership teams. And ideally, then they would filter that down into their schools and support their teachers to do more of that teaching and learning. What we discovered really quickly though, Tim, was that experts were few and far between in that space, and they were also not able to get to every school in every classroom. And so we had to then think about, well, what are the other ways that we can support more teachers and more schools to actually get that research and that translation of that back into the classroom? And that's really where Teach Well was born out of. But I would say that the evidence is actually quite clear on using these high impact instructional strategies and revisiting prior learning for students, in clearly chunking content and all of the principles of Rosenshine, for example. But where the research doesn't often help us is in the granularity, is in what it looks like in practice. And schools needed that support in implementation. They needed support in the how. And that's really where that school improvement program looked to support those school leaders. But as I said, it is school leaders. So where we weren't able to get to was often the teachers. How do you build the capacity of individual teachers and starting where they are in their classroom and seeing how they can get more from their students in terms of their outcomes?
Katie Roberts-Hull, it was great to hear you before talk about the Education Endowment Foundation and some of their research in England, and we've relied on that heavily, and particularly the 14 mechanisms for professional learning. It's a great piece and really easily accessible. 4 of us went on a study tour last year to England, and we met with the Education Endowment Foundation and learnt lots about some of that work. So it's really great to hear you reference that organisation in particular. Relevant to systems and improvement for systems, have you got anything you'd like to share with us on the notion of school improvement?
I mentioned that I worked for this organization called Learning First. Prior to working for Teach Well, kind of when I first moved to Australia, we would go on these trips that were usually funded by not-for-profits to high-performing systems around the world to find out what are they doing for school improvement, but specifically improving teacher professional learning. So we wrote a report called Beyond PD years ago where we visited, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, British Columbia, some of those systems that at the time were considered high performing, and just looked at, like, in a system, what are the different ways that you can make this work so that it's not just up to kind of these hero school leaders, which we know are really important, and it's important to get great people into school leadership, but it's really hard for systems to rely on that because there do need to be so many school leaders. It's tough, especially to put so much pressure on some of them that are brand new. So what can systems do to better support schools and make sure there's not that kind of school lottery or classroom lottery where students are getting in a different experience depending on where they're growing up? And I think one of the things that we found, especially in tighter systems like Singapore, is that there was just a lot more engagement between the kind of system leaders and the schools. So having that kind of reciprocal feedback in this kind of continuous way was really important, which I think I'm seeing a lot of in your system in Sandhurst now that you've started to do a lot of work kind of bringing schools together, but just making sure that the people who are sort of creating these professional learning experience opportunities at the system level really know what schools need. And that often involves not just speaking to schools, but, visiting schools. I know in Singapore, even when they would be thinking about like writing the curriculum, there was a whole process that took place over 5 years where people who were from the curriculum authority would actually go into schools and observe how the lessons were going in, for example, science, and be able to take that back and say, well, what do we need to change about our curriculum because of what we've seen on the ground? And so having that kind of feedback loop was really important for their continuous improvement. And I think that's just a big takeaway across the board. That systems, the more that they are in schools and getting feedback from people in schools is really helpful. The more that people from schools are doing little stints, working with the system or supporting the system to develop policies and programs can be really helpful. And then I think that also translates into schools. So the more that kind of school leaders are, in classrooms and getting feedback from teachers and observing instruction and taking that back into planning professional learning, the better and the kind of more responsive that professional learning will be for those teachers as well. So those types of feedback loops, which I think we all know about in terms of formative assessment for teachers and their students, are also important at every single level of systems, whether that's teacher to student or teacher to school leader or school leader to system. That's really what provides that kind of continuous improvement and that responsiveness to what people need to learn.
So about 6 years ago, Teachwell was created. Katie Webster, give us a bit of a detail look now at the work that Teachwell do, your role, and how it's really come to bear fruit in the areas that we've already discussed today in the conversation.
So back in 2019, as I said, there was a lot of enthusiasm in parts of public education in WA to actually train their teachers in these high impact instructional strategies, which were clearly outlined in the research. Yet there was very limited access to some of the amazing experts, some of them of which you will definitely know of. Dr. Lorraine Hammond was a massive influence in this space, but it was really hard to get to every teacher. And so what we looked at doing was designing a program that would be spaced out over time. We know the value of that for anyone learning anything is to have that spaced practice. And so we looked at creating a program which would take teachers ultimately through not only the evidence base, the why, but also very much practically the how. So we were really committed to building a really practical professional learning experience for teachers. And it started with only 100 educators in WA who were a bit of our pilot for this program. And we had 5 professional learning days spaced out over approximately 9 months. And why that was also so important was we wanted to have some pre and post data. So we wanted these teachers to be able to actually collect pre-course data around how their students were currently faring in terms terms of their learning, and also what the teacher's perspective was on what was happening in their classroom. And then that meant at the end of the 9 months, when they'd finished this professional learning journey, they would actually be able to capture some of that post-course data. So that would look at actually asking students in a survey some really clear questions about, have you noticed some changes in your teacher's practice? Does your teacher check that you understand a concept before they move on? So some really key feedback then from students, and also then looking at some student outcomes data post-course. And as part of that pilot, the word spread really quickly that teachers felt really empowered by sitting in that space for 9 months and having the accountability of a program with a lot of support to actually embed some of these strategies into their classrooms. So they always had someone at the other end of the phone if they needed. They were able to email us, obviously could spend time with us on the workshop days. And probably the most impactful, I think, was they also got to record short videos of themselves teaching in their own classroom, and they would submit a copy of that to our coaching team. But before we actually gave them feedback, we would ask the teacher to watch their video back, and we would ask them to self-reflect on what they noticed in their own practice. And hand on heart, most teachers identify what they want to work on next within the parameters of high impact instruction. And so what that really then led us to believe was this idea that teacher self-reflection is at the core often of improvement in this space. And it allowed every teacher to identify what was important for them in their context with their own students. Not some cookie cutter approach or one size fits all, but what's most important for them. And that really does then lead them to want to move more into this space. And I think that was one of the massive learnings we had really early on. And so since 2019, we've now worked very much nationally. So of course, we still do a lot of work in Western Australia, but we're in almost every state and territory now, 6 years on, or almost 7 years, I should say. And I think I was just writing down the latest stats, but we are up to more than 900 schools that we've worked with. And that equates to roughly about 8,500 teachers and leaders. So that is quite a big trajectory over the past 7 years. But some of those fundamental components of that program from the first year are still very much alive and well in the work we do at Teach Well.
And you have worked with a number of Catholic education systems across Australia, particularly I know Canberra Goulburn, some in Max, and Catholic Ed South Australia. Has the work varied and been nuanced and more bespoke as you've matured as an organisation?
Absolutely, absolutely. So our first Catholic education system that we worked with, Canberra Goulburn, was, I would say, a massive learning journey for us as an organisation and for them doing this incredible once-in-a-lifetime catalyst project. So very much learning from each other about what works, where we can support teachers, where we might need to tweak and iterate our content. And I think what's really important at a system level is when we're able to provide that professional learning support, that it is tailored to how the system really wants to focus their efforts. And so that's something that we take really seriously, is that this is a space in which an off-the-shelf program is probably not going to be suitable. We really need to make sure it is tailored and it's aligned to what the system is prioritising. And that can look really quite simply as correct terminology, so that when I say checking for understanding, I mean this is what it looks like in practice. So even getting down to terminology and being really clear, I think the last thing that teachers and leaders need in schools is confusion or miscommunication over language. And what we're really trying to do is build that shared understanding, but it does start by being really clear about what we mean when we say certain things in education. And so I think with each system, we do spend a lot of time making sure that is bespoke for what the system's prioritising.
Fantastic. Katie Roberts-Hull, you touched on some really important things earlier about time on task, cognitive engagement, full participation, that surely we can make our work not just easier for teachers, as you said, but you said better and better for students in terms of those outcomes. You can both take this wherever you like, but what matters most with regard to high quality instruction?
Well, I think you've hit on a lot of it. One of the biggest pieces for kind of, I guess, the foundations of high quality instruction are a lot of the things that you guys are doing with the mastery program with Knowledge Society to create classroom environments that are calm, where students know exactly what they're meant to be doing. And there's a lot of extra time because of those strong instructional routines for learning. So that's kind of the foundation that I think is really important. And honestly, it's an issue that a lot of schools and teachers are struggling with at the moment. We at Teachwell talk about how Australia's classrooms are sometimes noted as some of the rowdiest in the OECD. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's like violence going on, but that there's just a lot of kind of walking around in classrooms, teachers, students talking when teachers are talking, things like that. And so those kinds of foundations of instructional routines really set up the teacher to have more success with students. And then from there, I think there's two things that are kind of equally important, but we are now starting to try to bring together. One is that high quality curriculum resources, and the other are these high impact teaching practices. And so one kind of interesting thing that's new for Teachwell is this new collaboration with Ochre Education. And I think previously, Ochre had been developing these amazing free teacher created high quality instructional resources. Those were available for schools to use separately. Teachwell have been doing all of this work with high impact teaching practices and making sure that teachers knew what Rosenshine principles were, that they saw videos of what they look like in practice in different contexts. And now we have the opportunity to bring that together so that there's even more coherence for teachers, that they, on the instructional, for example, the mass Ochre resources that they are using, they can see how those resources might be used, for example, to get to full participation in a classroom with students. Bringing those full participation principles, those ideas around daily review, the importance of retrieval practice, teacher clarity around kind of, hinge point questions in a lesson, for example, that teachers are doing, that continuous formative assessment, and how that is related to the specific curriculum resources that teachers are using, I think has been a new thing for Teachwell and for Ochre. And that's been a really exciting part of our work now, is to kind of add that extra layer of coherence for teachers. But I think for teachers, those two things are kind of equally important, regardless of, what curriculum resources that they are using high quality curriculum resources, and that they know that they have the knowledge to be able to use that kind of high impact teaching practices in their daily instruction.
Thanks, Katie. The other Katie, if you were to ask Rosenshine's principles, which ones matter most?
Oh, it's a tough one, Tim. I think retrieval practice is so important. And I reflect on Rosenshine, even his very first principle is a short review of previous learning. And it sets up us really well to think about the power of review. But what I would want to ask Rosenshine is, can you be even more specific about what that short review of previous learning looked like in these high-performing classrooms and these teachers that you watched as part of the research that Rosenshine and his team did? So I think review is something that teachers and leaders know is important. They know that helps students to actually change their long-term memory. And it's so important even in practice, because teachers often have that experience of students coming in at the start of the year, they've entered the year 4 classroom, and it's blank faces across the board when the teacher starts to teach some of the content in the year 4 curriculum. And it's because a lot of students have simply forgotten over their school holidays. Their brains have been filled with all sorts of other wonderful things. And that's quite frustrating often for teachers, because they have to teach below grade level content and plug a lot of gaps in order for students to often be ready for the grade level curriculum that they're kind of mandated to teach. And it often comes back to that we're not activating enough retrieval practice throughout the year for students to actually change long-term memory. And I think that whilst teachers know the power of review, what they really often say to us is we need more support in how to get that done systematically over time. And I can't stay up till 11 p.m. every night, the blank sheet of paper, designing these reviews. And I think that's what Katie touched on as well, is the power of bringing together Ochre and having a high quality base resource that prioritizes retrieval practice, means that teachers actually have this springboard to do more of it with their students. students with a bit less of the workload that almost would be required to write these reviews from scratch. So I think that's the space that I would want to talk to Rosenshine a bit more on, and where I think some of the biggest golden component is of those principles of instruction.
Tom Sherrington did a podcast with Anna Stocky that was looking deeply at the Rosenshine principle. There's a little bit that he just goes a bit deeper in some of that retrieval and review space as well in that podcast. So, Katie, you're in good company with that one, and thanks for naming that today. I just wanted to touch on that point that you made then about that connection with the OCHA resources. And for anyone that's listening today and you hear that term we throw around, some would say too readily and too quickly, science of learning. But I think the complexity to what you and Katie have just discussed, it's a deep science, isn't it? There's a stack of work that has to go in this, and it's not easy. And for teachers that have gone through their career or much of their career having to cobble together or take enormous time in their own time, quite often, preparing some of this material, to have a nice lesson that flows, let alone considering all of that science of where review, is this spaced enough? Where have I interleaved it? When am I checking for understanding in the way that this lesson plays out? When some student might ask the question that comes way out of left field, and they've got to be agile and responsive enough to change the lesson direction. So it's not without ill consideration that this whole notion of science of learning is played out, and anything that we can do that further supports the teachers in the most complex of environments to have well-designed, systematic flow that's based in high-quality instruction in the science of learning is a no-brainer, really. So that's what gets us to today, and the work that we are all trying to do. Relevant to the work with Sandhurst, how are we working together? How the Teach Well work aligns with our instructional model, the work that we're already doing. You've mentioned Classroom Mastery of Time and a little bit around OCHA, the work that we're doing with Step Lab, and how that fits and complements that work as we do it together. And then we might just have a bit of a chat about some of the sessions that you've led with us so far.
I think when we first were connected, Tim, with Teach Well and Sandhurst was really around this feedback that you had been receiving as a group around we need a bit more of that knowledge building in that science of learning space, but even better would be the knowledge building and then what it looks like in practice. So we've obviously, as a system, you've really invested in building that science of learning knowledge base for your system. But then there's the next step, isn't it, which is the implementation of that. And I think that's where we were first connected and worked together on spending a day with your leaders of learning, which was back in November last year, and really working through what are the connections already to what they've already been exposed to, what they already understand from the evidence base. But then let's get a little bit more granular so that when they're using the amazing Step Lab platform and doing some instructional coaching, or when they're engaged with Classroom Mastery and how those cues and routines are working in their classrooms, that all of those connections are really clear and they've got a lot of confidence then on how it can look in practice. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do at Teach Well to support you in Sandhurst, is really about just building more confidence for everyone at every layer of the educational experience. So that's students, teachers, school leaders. It's all about, do I feel more confident now to use some of these strategies when I deem is necessary in my classroom? And do I feel more confident that I can gradually release these students on a complex skill because I have a really solid base from these curriculum resources that OCHA have provided, that I can do that a little bit better than maybe I did last year with a group of students? So I think this is all about knowledge building, confidence building, and ultimately having leaders and teachers walking away feeling like that day is really a continuation of a broader professional learning journey that Sandhurst is on as a system. So we've done that one day with the leaders, and then this year we're obviously engaged with your team to provide professional learning at more of that teacher level and looking at how do we make sure that we can integrate those OCHA resources and high impact teaching strategies across some areas of the curriculum so that teachers feel really empowered to then make it their own. And I would say here, this is a big principle for us at Teach Well. I think you share it as well at Sandhurst, is this idea that it's just any amount more. So if I can do a little bit more review with my students, if I can be a little bit more clear in how we're taking them through lots of background knowledge or big concepts that we're trying to develop, that will really help my students just learn a little bit more this year. And I think that's the narrative we try to bring to those professional learning days. And I think it aligns really nicely with the other partnerships that you've got at Sandhurst, and all of that evidence base being really, really the same. We're all drawing from it, and we're all providing that support at multiple layers in your system.
Thanks, Katie. It's such a good overview you've fed back to me and to our listeners. My mind went to Dr. Jared Cooney-Horvath as you were speaking then about learning new information and what's top down and what's bottom up in terms of our cognitive process, and how do we obtain that and agree with anything more is something that we've felt, and we've read feedback together that has come from our participants of leaders and of classroom teachers in Sandhurst that are saying, oh, gee, if only I had this then. But straight away they're probably saying, but I wouldn't have known what I know now then either. So there's this learning piece, isn't there, as we continue to embed habits of our own and learn new information in many cases, or consolidate previous learning and by bringing it out to the front again. There's great benefit in that work. So every layer that we've touched on with you has been really significant. And I really appreciate, on behalf of us at Sandhurst, to both of you and your staff, your willingness to engage. For our listeners out there, Teach Well weren't just called up to say, hey, can you present this thing next week? We spent a series of sessions together, and then Katie met with each of our learning leaders to learn more around their role, what it looks like from their perspective, learn about different partnerships that already exist in Sandhurst to ensure that the delivery complemented other sessions, and it wasn't just a one-off or a pop-up PD as we've referred to and mentioned the one-off one earlier. This is a sequence that makes sense, and that it is scaffolded in our instructional model and other work we're doing. So a huge thank you from us to you for the way that you've done that, and we've continued to receive really positive feedback, and we know we will into the future as well. Katie Roberts-Hull, in terms of your observations, I know you've been at 3 of our 4 sessions so far. What are you witnessing and seeing with the Sandhurst people?
I like how you ended one of the sessions that I went to by asking the group, what are they most proud of that they've kind of accomplished over the short time that you've been doing a lot of this professional learning work. And so just getting to scan the room and get a sense of what all of those schools say that they are most proud of was really fascinating, because they're all very different, of course, depending on sort of where they started and what their school context is. But you can tell that even though it can feel like a lot sometimes to try to change practice and to learn, to take learnings and put them into practice, the schools are feeling a bit more confident about, we have actually seen progress in some areas. If it's not actually student learning change that we've already been able to see, there's other indicators that are really promising for those schools, even things that it might just be around that calm kind of classroom, or things around teacher confidence, for example, with being able to understand, what does daily review look like. So all of that's, I think, really heartening to see. And when we do professional learning, we might get that kind of feedback that you mentioned, Tim, of like, oh, I wish I had this earlier. But it's sort of like when you're an adult and you have more knowledge of the world, and you're like, I wish I could go back to world history when I was in high school, because I would just appreciate it so much more. Like, I do think it does take a bit of practice and a lot of knowledge coming together before you're developing that schema as a teacher, where they're kind of now attaching what we're providing in Teach Well to their existing knowledge. That kind of metaphor of knowledge is like Velcro attaching to other knowledge. You can see that happening in the sessions that we're in, because you've already done so much work with your schools. And I think that's really great. And we do say at the Teach Well sessions that, we probably will touch on things that they maybe have heard before, but we're doing them in a slightly different way. And that kind of can help with that retrieval, but also just developing that schema that teachers have, their kind of mental model of like what the science of learning is, how students learn, and how that can be applied in the classroom on a daily basis. And I think The main thing that I'm seeing a bit more of, especially in your system, of those middle leaders. So those, people who are maybe deputy principals or kind of other middle leaders in school that are gaining confidence and that will be able to really benefit from, for example, the work that you're doing with Step Lab to create those kinds of cycles of coaching and rehearsals in schools. So, we've always seen our work with Teach Well as just building that knowledge that can be applied to all the other tools that these schools have, curriculum tools or a tool like Step Lab, and that it's really aligned to kind of everything that you're doing. But it's not, what we're doing isn't like another program that schools have to do. It's more, this is the kind of knowledge base that will set you guys up for success in kind of any of the things that you're doing in your schools. And yeah, so I just excited to keep doing the work. I think that already the schools that we've been able to learn a little bit about and hear about their context, it's been really fascinating to see what they're working on and, what their current challenges are. And we're really interested, I think we've talked with you about this before, but in our future sessions to kind of add on a couple school visits where we have those keen schools that would be willing to have us in to see more about what that looks like in practice. Because I think, like I said earlier, about having those feedback loops, it's always good for us to see in practice what schools are working on, because that helps us adapt our professional learning to make sure we're targeting, what teachers and schools need. But it's just great to see the kind of comprehensive suite of learning that you're developing in your systems to support schools.
It's so good to hear you talk about Velcro and memory sticking. Isn't it funny that we have conversations around how students learn, but perhaps we don't have them often enough around how staff learn? And for you in the sessions to reiterate that message around how it happens and perhaps even what the participants in the sessions are going through and why they are finding it hard or not might be dependent on the learning that they have had previously. And I think that that's a really important consideration for all of us as we work at a system level across so many staff to how learning happens and to really respect that and to reflect that back to our people as that learning is happening, just like good teaching does with the students as that's taking place. So primary, secondary, and the challenges or not that you face are relevant to delivery of this high impact, high quality teaching. It is really for everyone. And I'm just interested how you manage at Teach Well, that this is for them, it's not for us as a primary, secondary or a vice versa.
Yeah, look, you touch on something that's really common and something that we are often looking at Teach Well in the courses and the work that we provide to schools and school systems. Some systems decide to do a primary, secondary split, which means they'll have programs running just for secondaries or just for primary. But then there's a lot of systems that actually just prioritize even that transition from primary to secondary. And often we don't get to hear what our colleagues in secondary school or vice versa are seeing and hearing in classrooms. And I would say there's actually a lot of similarities between an upper primary classroom to an early secondary classroom. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's really, really important that we as presenters can demo and show examples from across the curriculum and also multiple different year levels. So what that means then is we can show some videos, some really short, sharp videos of, a year 10 classroom with some students responding in unison or using mini whiteboards. And that is working just as well as it is in an early primary context. However, having said that, we know there are some differences. So what I might do with very, very young children is going to be different to what I might do in a secondary year 9 classroom. So I'm not necessarily going to get my year 9 students with their tracking fingers up and tracking along with me, but I am going to get them to track with their eyes. And so these are the kind of adjustments or the tweaks that we think is really important to be very explicit about in our professional learning when we're working with primary and secondary teachers in the room. But that's where we should always start with that simple model of cognition on how we learn, because actually that doesn't change all that much from primary to secondary. So we have a lot of similarities that we can leverage off. And then I think what's also really important about our professional learning is that we have lots of discussion time or pair share opportunities throughout the days, which allows colleagues to work together to share across schools in similar learning areas or year levels about what this means for them in their context. And that's where we're actually saying, over to you to really think about how does that look in year 8, in your year 8 science classroom, as opposed to maybe the example I've shown, which is a year 6 house classroom. So these are the things that I think make the professional learning really impactful, regardless of whether it's primary or secondary.
Thanks so much for touching on that, because on April the 20th this year, we have a whole staff day in the system, about 3,000 staff in Sandhurst, and Teachwell are leading a session that no doubt will cover much of what we've discussed today, and our people can look forward to some practical, applicable, highly applicable approaches that can be delivered through the course of that day on checking for understanding and full participation, ultimately two big things. So if you're a listener out there wondering where do you get more from the relationship with Teachwell, it'll be with you and all Sandhurst staff on the 20th of April. And we have a series of upcoming workshops and programs for staff face-to-face in different locations across Sandhurst as well. So Katie Webster, thanks for that detail. Katie Roberts-Hull, you first. From everything we've discussed today, what matters most?
For me, it's the idea of continuous learning. The work never ends, stay on the course. Just having 1 year of focus on teacher learning isn't going to be enough. The real need is to just keep iterating and keep improving teacher learning year after year. Obviously, schools will need to be collecting data and making sure that they're on the right track. And it's definitely fine to adapt their pathway if they find they need to do something different. But I do think that's what teachers continuously tell us that they want, is that consistency. We want to keep going, keep doing what we've been doing, and not have so much kind of change in strategy over time. And so I know that that's something that you're already focused on in your system, and you've already started that kind of year-on planning of how teachers are going to continue that learning. But I think that's just so key, is to make sure that from the system level, you're having that ability to continuously support schools in this change, but also for teachers at the school level, that they are getting that rehearsal and feedback, and that there's somebody that's always providing that ability to help them with their classroom instruction improvement over time. That kind of continuity, that continuous learning is really important.
Thanks, Katie. It's such an important reminder of the need for consistent, calm, repeatable practices. To Katie Webster, what matters most?
I think this is actually a good summary of our chat today, Tim, but I think what matters most is a culture of high expectations at every level. So I think about what Magnify Sandhurst is doing is really having high expectations, not only for ourselves as individuals in education, but then for each other as well. So bringing that culture of expectations to the partners that you work with and the professional learning sequencing that you're organising for your schools. And then I think ultimately we want teachers to have those high expectations for their students. We know that teachers with high expectations get more progress for their students than teachers with lower expectations. And I think when we wrap around support like having high quality based resources with high impact instructional strategies, with a really important platform like Step Lab and other supports, that is actually a culture of high expectations in action. And I think we all believe in having high expectations, but what does it often look like? What are the behaviors? What are the things that actually we can tangibly point to and say, yes, that is a system that is enacting high expectations for their students? And I think that's what we're so excited to be a part of in this work with Sandhurst. And I think that's really what matters most to me.
Katie, thank you. You've just rounded out our conversation so beautifully. So thank you in advance for all of the work that you are doing in Sandhurst. We've enjoyed it immensely at every single level. And thanks so much for joining me today in our conversation.
That's it for this episode of Magnify Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about great teaching and learning. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we magnify what truly matters.